To stay eternally young, right? The eternal fountain of youth. I mean, now with AI technology, there's talk of downloading your brain and living eternally. I mean, that's how much people either are afraid of death or don't like the idea of death. They think we can come up with a way to, to beat death. But as Kathleen Dowling's book entitled The Grace in Aging, says that we should be awakening as we grow older. That's her subtitle. And there is a transformational movement going on worldwide right now that will reimagine the second half of life as not what it was in the past, a time of retreating, a time of shrinking, a time of doing less than you did prior to that in retirement. And so this new movement is seeing this new stage of life from 65 on as a time of getting re-inspired to do new things. And Kathleen's arguing that this should be the primary time where we give ourselves to spiritual growth. The Aging Gracing challenges readers to embrace the aging process physically, emotionally, spiritually, rather than seeking to forever preserve our fleeting youth and midlife. We talked before about because midlife is expanding, people are having a hard time leaving it. It's like, they want to stay in midlife all the way until they die. And there's something to be said for staying active, but just like a fruit eventually ripens and eventually dies, embracing the ripening process, as she calls it, is a way to find peace and joy and contentment in life, whatever life brings us each day. Rather than striving to achieve or maintain this illusory status of upward mobility or being a VIP, readers of her book are encouraged to stop and ask, what's really important to achieve in your life? And when you start to see that it has an expiration point, that you're closer to that than you were at the beginning, you start thinking about it more, I think, and that's healthy to do that. What do I really want to achieve in the rest of my life? It's a question that is worthwhile to reflect on every day, because it's in reflecting on this that we can give meaning to our life that we tend to just sort of take for granted. Now, writes Kathleen, is the time to abandon the lifelong pursuit of ego building, upward mobility, and instead embrace ego dismantling, downward mobility, to learn the grace of becoming nobody special. So, we want to think of ourselves, our ego wants to think of itself as very, very special, and so special that we can't even imagine the world without us in it. And that is something that has to be abandoned along the road to the end of our life. We're eventually going to become nobody. So this is book 2 in the series. She wrote, The Grace in Dying was the first one. As a hospice nurse, she has plenty of experience with bedside people dying and learned a lot of things. We talked about the 4 stages in the nearing death experience of being the reverse of what happens as a child gains its ego. It notices the difference between myself and other, between life and death, between our mind and our body, and between our true self and shadow self. Well, just as those are stages, those stages get dismantled in the dying process. And that's helpful, because she says you don't have to wait till you die to go through those processes of shedding your ego. You can do it as you live through spiritual practices, meditation, and simply just being aware of it. So 80 million Americans face a new world of being over 60. Kathleen encourages us to focus on awakening to the magnificent opportunity this season of life offers to practice the presence of God in preparation for the challenges of growing old and dying. So, growing old and dying has challenges that involve pain and suffering sometimes, everything from arthritis to other types of illness that are just a normal part of aging. And we're going to age, and we're going to have these aches and pains. So if we prepare for it ahead of time, then we don't consider it, we don't feel as entitled to be in perfect health as we do if we embrace the fact that this is what is going to happen in the future, so we can prepare mentally for it. It's just like anything else. If you are prepared for something, then you can deal with it better when you get in the midst of it. It's like writing a will or making your wishes known about how you want to spend your last days, etc. A few years ago when my own mom was passing away of dementia, I read her book, Through Grace and Dying. And I remember I was very impressed with the very opening of it. It says, if you or someone you love is in the process of passing away, put this book down and go spend time with them. In other words, your presence with that person is much more important than anything I'm going to say in this book. And the main thing she wanted to get across was dying is safe. There's nothing to fear. And, that is a message that people need to hear. They need to believe it. It needs to sink into their spirit, because the fear of death is a huge limitation that people deal with, to the point they don't even want to discuss it. They don't even want to think about it. They don't want to conceive of it. So, as a hospice nurse, she has a lot of experience with seeing people go from this life to death transition. Readers are encouraged to the largely unknown steps of the nearing death experience, in which the ego is systematically dismantled on our deathbed. So from her perspective, aging gracefully is no accident. It's not something that just happens randomly. It requires taking intentional steps, just as becoming a true elder requires more than just getting old, right? I mean, you know lots of people who are old, but they really don't qualify as a spiritual elder or even an intellectual elder or anything else. They're just an old person that can be very, very cranky and dysfunctional in their old age, and even more so. Aging gracefully, you have to intentionally do it. So the following are 33 points that which help me awaken after reading The Grace in Aging, and I hope they'll speak to you as well. So let's just go through the 33 and discuss them as much as we can in the time we have. Okay, so number one, discussion of aging and dying is too often been a neglected topic. However, mindful and intentional reflection and discussion can free us from the confinement of the self and separation from the sacred. So when we discuss this with family, friends, in a group such as this even, and reflect on it, it gets us thinking outside of ourselves. And so there are many ways that this is taking effect in movements of families having dinner table discussions about death in frank terms of what do you want to be done, and to actually talk about it in addition to maybe writing it out, so that your wishes can be followed rather than somebody else's wishes. Because if you don't be very specific about how you want your death, whether it's at home or whether whether you want life preserving equipment used to keep you alive indefinitely, if you don't discuss those things, then the medical community kicks in, and their goal is to keep you alive as long as possible, or as long as the money is there to pay for it, whether it's insurance or something. So it's better to talk about it. So discussions of aging and dying have been neglected, but now seemingly there's sort of a renaissance of people being willing to talk about it, which is great. Number two, being old is new for us due to an extended midlife. So our generation is one of the, the longest living generation. Well, I guess you could go all the way back to Bible times where they lived, in some cases, to 150 or more years. Don't ask me how, but the point is, in modern history, we are now living longer, and medical breakthroughs seem to make it even more feasible to live longer. But it's a new experience in history, and can be difficult to recognize that our youth is ended. Adjusting to aging and our new place in the world takes time. So, we're at a new, epoch, you might say, with medical breakthroughs and people living healthier, and so that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been discussed as much in the past, because we weren't living as long. Point three, spiritual practices can accelerate the awakening process now rather than waiting till we're on our deathbed. Kathleen stresses the importance of learning to be present and explains the need to put on the mind of Christ and shed what Buddhists call the mind of aversion. So that was kind of a new term to me as I read through this book, the mind of aversion, being I'm not a Buddhist. But I do think that there's great truth in it. The mind of aversion is basically having an anticipated outcome of something, and you're not going to be happy unless it turns out that way. You're adverse to this situation or circumstance going this way. So that would be a mind of aversion. The opposite of that would be a mind of, you might say, acceptance of anything and everything and all things as they come, and not to fight that circumstance, but to embrace it as a circumstance that can be used by God to accomplish something in our life, and that fighting it is oftentimes, in the Buddhist, they point out, the root of suffering. So the root of suffering is when things don't go our way, and it causes us to have angst and frustration over something not going our way. Well, wouldn't it be better to just kind of take a deep breath and say, it's all good, even if it's not. Even if it's not exactly what I wanted to happen. If you can get to a point where you'd allow the circumstance to change you, instead of you being hell-bent, let's call it, on changing a circumstance, then that is a point of maturity, I think, that is very much similar to stated in the positive of having the mind of Christ. So the mind of Christ would be, again, this perfect understanding that God is in charge of all things and that everything works together for the good. As hard as that is to see at the present moment, or it can be. So I see it's kind of two sides of the same coin, this Buddhist view of shedding the mind of aversion, and the Christian version of having the mind of Christ. So I saw a connection there that I thought was kind of cool. Number four, the process of aging allows us to ignore our earthly impermanence due to its slow-moving changes in the way that active dying does not. So, no wonder we stay asleep for most of our life. It's happening so slowly that, our aging process, that from day to day, we don't notice much difference, right? Like it's not like a new wrinkle apply, comes up the next day. It takes years, right? Well, the same way though, that if you're in the process of dying, somebody's just given you say a death sentence or a life expectancy of 1 year. Well, now you have 365 days to get everything together. You start thinking much more seriously because you have a deadline. And so that's what she's saying, is that this process of aging allows us to ignore our impermanence in a way that dying doesn't. The pattern of impermanence is universal. What makes us think that we can be a permanent fixture when everything else on earth goes through a life cycle, lives, dies, and in some cases is resurrected or reincarnated? But the point is, it does go through a death, and it's impermanent in its present state. Hope springs eternal, yet as we age, our future hope diminishes a bit as we realize we have fewer days ahead of us than behind us. So this kind of explains why people avoid talking about the aging process, is because nobody wants to acknowledge that it's actually happening. It's slow moving until you get an illness, and then all of a sudden you lose the use of something. A friend of mine recently had a stroke. He's lost the use of his left hand, and so now he realizes that that part of him is not functional, and that eventually that's going to be the way it is probably with his whole self. And I mean, he's in his 80s, so this is a hard thing to grasp. He was the picture of health until this stroke happened. So aging, or that active dying or active spiritual practices can allow us to embrace and prepare for our own impermanence. As we age, point 5, we're called to explore our hidden inner vistas as well as outer vistas. Lightening our attachment to ourself now will help us get through the aging and dying process more gracefully. And that's sort of a restatement of one of the earlier ones, but I like the way she says to explore our inner vistas. In other words, our inner work needs to be done, not just our outer vistas. And lightening our attachment to ourself. So this is a process of detaching ourself from ourself. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen quickly. It's almost like 3 steps forward, 1 or 2 back. 2 back. Because the self claws back the ground and wants to say, wait a minute, what about me? Don't forget me. If only we knew that the me that we think we are is an illusion, but we don't get that. Point 6, aging gracefully and mindfully requires our intention. Awakening practices can help some 80 million Americans that are 60 plus to attain peace of mind, as well as helping us mentor our youngers. So it has to become something that we sort of set as a goal, not just accidentally stumbling onto. It's not going to happen just because we're getting older. We have to make the intention to do it. And that's why we see worldwide practices of spiritual practices of meditation, prayer, gaining momentum. Many ways the traditional church is shrinking because it's dealing with more external things and things that are dealing with inner vistas are on the increase, I believe, right now. Probably because people are aging all over the planet. The whole planet is aging. In America is just one example of it. Japan, it's even more so. It has to do with how many children people have, and that has been declining. Point 7, aging forces us to look at our shelf life and our self life. I like that. I thought that was good. We know that everything has a certain shelf life. If a battery sits around forever, and it's going to eventually drain its power, and so food, etc. Everything has a shelf life. Who I am beyond the persona I have presented to the world. So that forces us to look at our true self, not just our false self. Okay, point 8. What really matters at this point in my life? If we have thoughts and desires to ripen into spiritual maturity and a greater experience of the sacred, now is the time to pursue it, to grow up. And I thought of that scripture in 1 Corinthians 13 where Paul says, when I was a child, I thought and spoke as a child, but then there comes a time in which we are called to grow up. And that's really what we're talking about here, is growing up spiritually, growing up and maturing. And the time to do it is now. If we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? Wait until our deathbed to do it all of a sudden? I love number 9. This is a quote from Thich Thich Nhat Hanh. I am of the nature of growing old, and there's no escape. I am of the nature of ill health, and there's no escape. I am of the nature to die, and there is no escape. All that I love will be separated, and there is no escape. So, this is not grasped by the ego. It always thinks there's going to be an escape hatch. So, if we let that sink into our heart and our mind and our spirit, that we're approaching an ultimate place where there is no escaping death, and there is no escaping having some bad health. Some people have good health all the way to their last breath. That's more the exception. But it's, some people are blessed in that way. We're going to be separated from our loved ones. That's painful. But if you believe in resurrection, then you realize that you will likely be reunited. And so that gives us hope that even though we lose people in this life, that we will eventually be reunited. Point 10. Most have had fleeing moments of selfless awareness, glimpses of formlessness and liberation. To embrace selflessness is to embrace freedom and the dance between form and formlessness. So here we're getting a bit philosophical, but the belief system that most of the major spiritual wisdom traditions embrace is that when we die, we go from this form into formless, back into the ground of being, back into union with God, which is where we came from before we were here. How bad can that be? Like, I think it was Mark Twain said regarding death, he said, I was dead for billions of years before I was born, and it hasn't caused me a bit of trouble. And I thought, yeah, that puts it in perspective that, we don't have any bad memories before we were born, and likely we're gonna go to a place of even more glorious life in eternity than it is at the moment. But these glimpses that we have of liberation from the body, embracing selflessness, to embrace this freedom and this dance between form and formlessness. So most of us have a fleeting, like we talked about before in the first stages of awakening, we have these little moments as children, or just little tastes of the freedom that's available to us in awakening. And what we need to do is to learn how to sustain those and eventually live and walk in them most of the time. Wouldn't that be great? That would be literally bringing heaven into earth or into us right now, not something that we have to push off into the future. I think a lot of the church has pushed into the future things that Christ intended for us to experience in the present. It's a sad thing. But point 11, to ripen into an elder is more than merely getting old, because that's what we said a little earlier. It requires a realization that everything that can be lost will be lost. Let's be resurrection life, not death has the last word. Did I write that right? Let's be resurrection. Life, not death, has the last word. Many people think death has the last word, and that's it. And if that was your view, then you have a little bit of a reason to be depressed about death, if you think death is the last word. Matthew Fox is another contemplative author, very brilliant author, who said that. But he's saying, let's be the resurrection. Let's live it. Let's be in the moment of it, not push it off to something in the future. We must examine our attachments, none of which will last, and that includes our bodies and relationships. So we're very much prone toward getting attached to things, to stuff, to what people think of us, to our reputation, to our looks, etc. All of that is, none of it's going to last. And so we might as well start working on detaching ourselves from those attachments. And one of the ways to do that I started with like a decade or so ago was just becoming more of a minimalist and giving away stuff and not having as much stuff to drag around from one place to the next. But it isn't just about those things. It's attachments to attitudes and ways of thinking and stuff like that, as well as stuff. But you know what? It's not going with us, so we might as well learn how to detach from it and hold it very lightly, and not grasp onto it. Number 12, to awaken, we begin by looking and truly seeing reality. As we age, we fear the loss of our control, our appearance, our health, our mental ability, our reputation, our self-image. The moment that changes, everything arrives unannounced. So I was trying to understand what she means by that. So the moment that changes, that we're attached to these fears of our external stuff, everything arrives unannounced. So we begin to accept whatever comes our way without, again, having this mind of aversion that says, oh no, I only want to think of myself as how I looked 20 years ago. Or, I only want to think of myself as being mentally, having a perfect memory, or having a spotless reputation, etc. So I think this is what Jesus meant when he talked to, some of the religious leaders and said, you see, but you don't see. You have eyes, but you don't see. And I think that's true, can be true of all of us, that we're seeing, but we're not seeing reality. We're seeing a false illusion of what we think is important. And so as we age, we awaken by looking and truly seeing things. And as we see things with the eyes of Christ, we begin to love everything and everyone. And we begin to accept and offer mercy. And we're not judging things as we once did when we were younger, perhaps. Number 13, our suffering will be controlled by our willingness to accept reality. Aging, suffering, and death are in fact treasures for those who with understanding and wisdom. Okay, this is a bit of a stretch for most people. Let's face it, aging, suffering, and death, a treasure? How so? With understanding and wisdom, we see they remind us of what's real. And that's what our suffering will be controlled by our willingness to accept reality. So it is the inability to accept reality that is the root of our suffering. A lot of our suffering is self-imposed, in other words, because we're not willing to accept what life brings to us. Those who can embrace those things as treasures are those with wisdom and understanding. That one takes a little while of chewing on that, but I think it's absolutely true. So I don't want to suffer any more than I have to. I don't know about you. We can limit it by our willingness to accept whatever circumstance that we got. 14, our life begins with enduring dependency as an infant, then we move to independence as we mature, right? Then we learn interdependence as an adult. But then guess what? At the end of life, we go back to dependency. Only this time, oftentimes it's in shame. This cycle of life, at the end of life, when we're dependent on others, we have a temptation to be ashamed of that. We don't like that. We don't want, we want to be, I am a rock, I am an island. I don't want anybody else to have to depend on anybody else. But it is that very dependence on other people that God can use to remind us of our, impermanence and of our frailties. And so seeing that cycle, but it's interesting, I thought that as an infant, we think this dependency is adorable. We think it's just the most wonderful thing in the world. This little child is totally dependent on mother and father. And so in the beginning, dependency is embraced, but at the end of life, there's shame involved with it. And it doesn't have to be that way, but we tend to take it that way because it's an assault to our ego.
Well, yeah, you're in anger right then, and you're hurting and you're in pain.
Yeah.
And you're saying, this is it, I get to live in this moment. I don't want to live in this moment, I want to live in any other moment.
Right.
And that's why hospice is so important at the end, because the closest person to you gets all that.
Yeah. Absolutely true. 15, the standards of success in midlife are very different from older life. So there's another little aha moment that in midlife, rather than, still being about upward mobility, we begin exploring downward mobility in the second half of life. Some people never, ever, right up to the end, see their standard of success changing.
They won't let it. They won't.
Right. They won't allow it. They want it to be upwardly mobile all the way till they're, they go out feet first.
Sounds like a great escape. I can just stay immersed in this, and I'll just transcend death as when I die, because I'll be so involved in this, I won't care, and in touch with everything toward the end.
So realizing that the standards of success are changing is the first step toward adjusting from upward to downward mobility. Point 16, learning how to let go while living saves us much difficulty and psychological anguish at death. If you see people anguishing at death, it's because they have not learned to let go of much of anything in life. Living with defendedness of ourself prevents us from loving fully. To contemplate aging and dying brings us to a new view of wisdom and an instant reordering of our priorities. So what seemed important in midlife and early life gets reordered as we move into the aging and dying stage of life. We learn how to hopefully drop our defenses of ourself. I found it interesting that, I read this other book, Undefended Love, written by a couple of psychologists, which deal with couples. And the biggest problem that most people have in their communication is the walls that we put up to defend ourselves. And until those come down, there's no way to really have intimacy with our spouse or family member, friend, or anybody. So we have to let the shields go down. I like that she says, living with defendedness of ourself prevents us from loving fully. So we want to love fully, we become undefended. That means we're open up to possibly getting hurt, but that's the way the love path goes, is that you're going to be open to some hurts. But it's worth it. It's well worth it. 17, forgiveness. The real culprit behind unforgiveness is the mind of aversion. That was kind of an aha moment for me too. To our disappointment, frustration, irritation, anger, judging, annoyance, and hate. So if you remain adverse to all of those things, then you're going to end up with some unforgiveness that you don't know what to do with it. You don't know how to get rid of it because you're adverse to disappointment, frustration, irritation. The opposite of that would be to be able to embrace disappointment, embrace frustration, irritation, even anger, to stop judging and hating. And you're going to be able to forgive everything and everyone. And what a life of freedom to have no one offend you. I mean, what's left of you to offend? If the you, your ego you, is in the process of dying, how do you offend a dying man? I think that's what Paul said when he said, that we're dead men in Christ, that our flesh or our ego self, if it's dead, there's no way to hurt it. There's no way to offend it. It's already gone. There's no me to offend left. So forgiveness, the real culprit behind unforgiveness is the mind of aversion. That's a good enough reason to start working on not having a mind of aversion, just so that there's no unforgiveness in your life. Because that's the one thing that people, bitterness and unforgiveness, when they die with that, is very painful. It's very, very painful. 18, aversion arises from inappropriate attention. And this example she gives is the story of the princess and the pea. You remember that?
Yeah, I love that one.
Yeah, that was a great story. Like sometimes I felt like that myself because I like a particular type of bed. Yeah. I like, a Tempur-Pedic foam bed that is, just so soft. And when I go to stay in hotels that are just plain old beds, I'm like tossing and turning, and I feel like the princess and the pea. I can't get comfortable. We set ourselves up for an impossible goal if we live with a mind of aversion, such as life without death, meeting without parting, gain without loss, pleasure without pain. We resist reality, which traps us in suffering. So, again, this mind of aversion starts by having inappropriate attention on something that we should just let go. You know, sometimes somebody has little habits, you know, especially when you live with them, that really get under your skin, and you know that we develop an aversion to. Somehow we have to just learn to let them go. Inappropriate attention, focusing on too much on some little thing, and we end up suffering every time they do that thing. So rather than resisting it, just let it go is her advice. 19. A mind unwilling to let go cannot enter the tender world of surrender. To gradually work on it before we either systematically or suddenly lose our health, wealth, friends, family, or even our body. So, wait, did I read that right? Excuse me, I skipped one. A mind unwilling to let go cannot enter the tender world of surrender and presence. By nature, we have a tendency to like being angry and having a target to direct our anger at, someone to blame. I mean, you've heard of the blame game. We like it. We love being able to, you know, crank about something and then, you know, have a good reason to do it and have somebody to blame. So, but a mind that's unwilling to let go of these things cannot enter the world of surrender and presence. And that's the place we want to live, is a surrendered life and a present life. You're not going to be able to get there if you are blaming and being angry and giving excuses why your mind of aversion is justified by somebody else. It's our choice to let go of that or not. 20. It's wise to practice ridding our mind of aversion while we have time to gradually work on it before we're either systematically or suddenly lose our health, wealth, friends, family, or even our body. So we practice this. This is not something that happens overnight. While we have time, we can gradually work on it. Let go of little aversions before you let go of big ones. And, we're going to be so much freer and happier about it. We're going to stop, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over, expecting a different outcome. We're going to stop doing that, stop making ourselves insane over that as we, while we have time to do it. And we have time to do it the moment we recognize that we're doing it and we're still breathing and have good health. So, 21, it is wise to rid ourselves of unforgiveness long before the dying process demands it. I thought that was interesting, that the dying process literally demands that we forgive for our own peace of mind. So why put it off? Over time, we have developed deep neural pathways of negativity against those who we feel have caused us anger, pain, and upset. We do not like to let go of grudges because they are the foundation of our stories, right? We tell our story and feel justified because we have a grudge about something. Our grudges keep us stuck in the past for all time, causing us to miss living in the now. So if there's any great reason to forgive and live with without a mind of aversion, it is so that we can live in the now because we're not stuck in the past and replaying it over and over. But I thought it was interesting that I never thought about it, that their neural pathways of negativity have been developed, especially with people that we're around a lot. I think of a couple of my daughters who don't get along sometimes, and the very thought of the two of them being together, they preconceive that it's going to be a negative time because it's happened so many times. And so getting them to move out of that neural pathway of negativity is not easy. In fact, I can't do it. It's only something that can happen within them. But I can model it myself, but I can't really tell them how to do it. But how do you get out of those negative pathways. It's by creating new pathways and getting rid of grudges, just sort of cleaning the slate and not being stuck in it. And then you can live in the moment. So much do we miss because we're stuck thinking about all the negative stuff in the past. So, point 22, anger and grudges are a spiritual survival pattern established as a protection of the self from external threats, but they're also obstructions to the awakened self. So there's a reason why we have anger and grudges. It's a survival thing that we create in our mind that protects us from, being hurt by other people, external threats. So there's some logic behind why it happens, but there are also obstructions to an awakened self. So we have to make a choice. Are we mature enough to move beyond needing that protection and be vulnerable enough to external threats? And the payoff is that our self is more present and more surrendered to being, representing love to that person. 23, the mind of aversion is a major distraction to our spiritual evolution, which creates stress, lost days, and lost years in family conflicts. The mind of anger also keeps centuries of international wars going on. So, this mind of aversion is quite deep in all cultures, and everything from feuds that go on between families to nations, differing worldviews, so it's really a very serious root and a major distraction to spiritual evolution. So much so that if you can't get rid of it, you're probably going to stay stuck at a certain level of spiritual growth until you can learn how to embrace those things that you've been adverse to. 24, meditation and spiritual practices can help dissolve the mind of aversion and release the mind from attachment to self. Beyond self is our real home, the ground of being. The boundary between self and reality is dissolved by an awakened mind. The illusion of duality dissolves. So, dissolving this mind is a process: meditation, prayer, forgiveness, confession. And so these are ways that we help, and just also recognizing it, just mentally, being cognizant of this mind of aversion can release our attachment, and and the illusion. You see, I think of how is it that Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor, and love your enemy? That's where I think he was saying that aversion that you have to your enemy, you even got to let that go. So he was actually teaching the same thing in the process of aversion, because to Christ, I don't think he saw anyone as an enemy. They may have been his enemy, and others, they may have hated him, but he didn't hate anyone. He loved even his enemies. And he, by the power of his Spirit, has given us that same ability to love our enemies. But it requires digging deep and letting go of this aversion. Now, that doesn't mean you have to embrace and believe everything your enemy does. If they believe, in evil things, you don't have to do that. But you can still, love the person, the being, not the behavior or the belief of them. So, okay, coming around the corner here, number 25 in our 33 ways to age gracefully. And presence, liberation from frivolity and other non-essentials. Most of us are rarely at home in the present, in the now, and yet this is where we find the grace that we long for. Frivolity and other non-essentials. I would say we live in a culture that seems to now, because of our wealth, now live in a world of frivolity. And we miss the most important things, the essential things, being present in the moment. We're always rushing and reaching for something more. We're very rarely at home with just good right now as is. We want to wait till this gets better, or that gets better, or this happens. And yet, once we're at home in the present and at peace, we find the grace that we long for. So, I mean, we've had it all along. It's been within us. That's why Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within. It's not things that you seek outside, even God that you're seeking outside. It's the God that's within you and allowing that God to shine through, being present. 26, most people spend the vast majority of their life trapped in frivolity, an illusion of what is essential, due to being stuck in either the past or worried about the future. Presence has no room for self. It requires practice and skill to focus our attention on the present. But this is the key, or one of the keys to the kingdom of God, is giving our attention in the present. And, that's why I'm so happy to see kids, the younger generation, kind of dropping their pursuit of stuff and more about being present, adventures, traveling, learning about other cultures, minimalism, all of these things that kids are seemingly, I think that it's kind of like a pendulum that has swung, from the silent generation, they went without a lot of stuff. The boomer generation, they wanted it all. We want it all, everything. Even the t-shirt that says, I got it all, and, and then now the next generation is swinging back, not to the same place as the silent, but to a different place so there's an evolution that's going on, and hopefully upgrading of seeing that memories and experiences and relationships are more important than stuff. And I think we forgot that in a lot of ways in the boomer generation, still forgotten it. 27, regarding commitment to practice the presence of God, Brother Lawrence, and that's the title of a book he wrote entitled Practicing the Presence of God. It's a real classic. It's a real small little book. It's really good. He said that he felt like he was holding a rope in a snowstorm to maintain his daily focus on imitating Christ. So he was a very humble brother that was lived in a monastery, and he would wash dishes, and he wrote this book about practicing the presence of God. And no matter what you did, however humble, lowly it may be, or you can still be in walking Christ, no matter how humble your calling in life is or whatever. But he said that it was like to maintain his focus on walking with Christ. He said it was like being in a snowstorm and holding onto a rope and using that rope to make your way through the snowstorm to get to the destination you want. And that he was thankful that God gave him a rope that he could keep his focus on Christ. And so she makes the point in the book of bringing that up. I thought that was good. It's like having a compass, a rope, or whatever you want to call it. The compass is the Spirit of God leading us where we should be going. Many people rely on laws and rules to tell them where they should go, but the true spiritual person has an internal compass, an internal spirit that's leading and guiding us into the presence of God, and that's how we can keep our spirit focused on being present. 28. If we faced the first death, the second death can do us no harm, said St. Francis. So what is this first death? I believe it's the death of the ego, the death of the false self, the death of who we think we are. Once that person dies, we essentially become like walking dead men, and we don't fear death anymore. There's no second death that can do us any harm. A radical opening of heart and mind occurs during the dying process, releasing all that has kept us closed in life. So rather than being a negative, depressing thing, when you really understand what goes on in the dying process, it actually is very releasing and beautiful experience. It's part of life that should not be feared. So that's why he can say there would be no fear of it, because you've experienced, and meditative practices and prayer is in a way a dying to yourself, because you're spending time in silence, you're spending time reflecting internally and listening rather than talking. And I think a lot of people think prayer is only talking rather than, but God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so there's a clue there. Maybe we should spend twice as much time listening.
And hit me with a brick, because I don't hear it the first time. So
Yeah.
throw it a little harder.
Yeah. 29, to cultivate an open heart is immeasurably noble and rewarding, good for yourself and the world around you. Release the burden of being someone. Dissolve the illusory wall that divides us from one another and from the divine, as Ram Dass said in Becoming Nobody. So there's an illusory wall that we're separate. We're not all connected in the spirit, and there's an illusion that the divine is external rather than internal. And so as we release those and see those walls dissolved, we begin to look on one another and love them and love God. And we realize that we see the God within each person. And it isn't important anymore that we see ourselves as super special. Number 30, the goal is to cultivate an undefended heart and an undefended mind. Very counterintuitive, right? The world says, you got to defend yourself, self-defense. I plead self-defense, Your Honor. In the spiritual world, there is no pleading self-defense. We are to be undefended. You want to, like Jesus said, you want to hit me go ahead, hit me on the other side too. Now, I don't think that, he was really a glutton for punishment. I think he was just saying that's how undefended spiritual people are to be, that we're not worried about what you can do to us physically. We're more concerned with that other person's soul and seeing that God is love. And if it takes me getting beat up for you to see that I can still love you, even while you're abusing me, if that can communicate to you the graciousness, the mercy of love of God, then so be it. I'm okay with it. Imagine being able to love everyone, everything, and every circumstance. This ability for deepening compassion is found in every tradition. It is the imitation of Christ. So we do have the capacity to do it, but it's a big intentional choice to be very counterintuitive, very countercultural in being willing to have an undefended heart and an undefended mind. So that's the goal. We won't always arrive there. We'll go back and forth. But just like in that 4 quarters of spiritual growth that we talked about last time, it comes in waves, and we eventually get to the point of union, hopefully with one another and with God, almost continually. That would be, if we were in that state continually, then we would kind of have reached nirvana or heaven or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so 31, the four immeasurable practices, this is according to Buddhism, is love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, which promote inclusivity and a path out of selfing in the Buddhist tradition. I thought that was an interesting word, selfing. Yeah, I mean, that's not a word that you ever hear. Almost, probably, I don't even know if it's in the dictionary, but you get what it's about. Most of us live in a place of selfing. So loving, compassion, joy, equanimity. These are the immeasurable practices in Buddhism. And, love, joy, and peace, it really follows pretty much in all of the different wisdom traditions. Point 32, conduct a periodic spiritual awakening inventory. And I think that's kind of what we talked about last time in writing a spiritual biography. Writing it out, doing an inventory that examines the areas that we've ripened in and the areas that we're still holding back. Paul said that by their fruit you shall know them. And what are the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, long-suffering, goodness, gentleness, kindness, etc. There were list 9 fruits of the Spirit. Do an inventory. Am I a peaceful person? Am I a joyful person? Am I gentle? Am I kind? That's how we know if we're ripening properly, is if the fruit is appearing. If it's not, then, that we still have some work to do, and that's okay. But she's saying the spiritual awakening inventory can serve us, and seeing areas that we're still working on, and that's cool. And lastly, number 33, if you want to identify me, ask me not where I live or what I eat, said Thomas Merton. Ask me what I am living for. Ask me what I think is keeping me from living fully. So, we all want to be able to identify who is me, and Merton is saying it's not how big my house is or how luscious my food is. The table back then, really it was done by class. People that had money had big spreads of food, and so that was kind of how you identified the class you were in, etc. But he says instead of that, ask me, what am I living for? Am I living for myself? Am I living for others? Am I living for God? Am I living for the purposes of God? Ask me what I think is keeping me from living fully. So, and that's a personal question we all have to answer. What is it that's stopping us? Like Kathleen pointed out, at each of the 4 stages, there were 2 questions to ask: what's moving you forward and what's holding you back? So he's saying actually almost the same thing here. What is keeping you from living fully? And generally we'll find that it's some desire to stay in our comfort zone, some desire to
not change things up.
Yeah, to not suffer, to not go beyond where I think I need to. So her conclusion, I am grateful for the wisdom, or my conclusion in reading the book, I am thankful for the wisdom Kathleen freely shares in this and her other books. She represents one of the foremost leaders in self-discovery and emerging inner spiritual awakening movement, which seeks to find points of agreement between spiritual traditions and help guide seekers further down their own spiritual enlightenment path. I also highly recommend her book, The Grace in Living, which we went through last time, which encourages spiritual sojourners to recognize and then write down their spiritual awakening biography that describes the progressive movement from our small, false self into being our true self. So, with that, I say amen, and my battery's almost dead.